Great, let's get started. Good day. Good day, everyone. Goedendag. Is that pretty good?
Pretty good.
Pretty good. I'm Michael Van Den. I am the chair of the West Michigan chapter of the Netherland-America Foundation, and I welcome you to this timely discussion about the resilience of arts organizations amid COVID-19. If you have questions at any time during our conversation, please enter them into the chat box in this Zoom site. The Netherland-America Foundation, or the NAF, was founded in 1921, and it seeks to further strengthen the bond between the Netherlands and the United States through exchange in the arts, sciences, education, business, and public affairs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was one of the early founders and supporters of the organization, and you can learn more about the organization at thenaf, THENAF.org. Our brand new chapter here in West Michigan is just getting started, and if you are interested in lending a hand, well, please indicate that by entering your name and email in the chat box in the Zoom site, and we'll get in touch. We have two distinguished Dutch Americans leading our conversation today, Mary Tuuk and Buursma. And I'll introduce you to Bruce, and he will host our conversation with Mary and introduce her to you. Buursma has been managing his own communications firm for more than a decade, helping clients tell their stories through the printed word, as well as through videos and documentary films. He's a seasoned consultant and a decorated journalist, having been named a Pulitzer Prize finalist in specialized reporting during his tenure at the Chicago Tribune. Bruce, hand it over to you, and we'll be delighted to listen in on your conversation with Mary.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I'm really delighted to help lead this conversation on behalf of the fledgling West Michigan chapter of the Netherland-America Foundation. As a son of a Dutch immigrant myself, the old country has been a pretty significant part of my life from my earliest days. My dad taught me to count to 10 in Dutch and Frisian about the same time I learned that trick in English. He also taught me how to say in Frisian, "I'm sorry, Dad, and I'll never do that again." I had to repeat that line quite often during my childhood. I could say it again, but it sounds vaguely dirty in the Frisian language. I've been fortunate to visit the Netherlands often during my adult life, both for business and pleasure. I reported on a number of events in the Netherlands for the Chicago Tribune, including the 1985 Pausbezoek, the papal visit of Pope John Paul II. More recently, my wife Judy and I have hosted frequent travel adventures to the Netherlands on behalf of our friends at Witty Travel and Tours, including a number of bike and barge trips. Last year, I took my two brothers and their spouses on a sentimental journey to Friesland and several other provinces to see some of the small villages where our ancestors lived, as well as the world-class museums and attractions in Amsterdam and The Hague, where Dutch culture is on impressive display. And speaking of culture, we're in for a treat as we welcome into our conversation the innovative impresario of the Grand Rapids Symphony, the remarkable Mary Tuuk. Mary's been president and CEO of the Symphony for the past 2 years as a glorious capstone on a distinguished career in the law, banking, and retail. After graduating from Calvin University with a double major in music and business, Mary earned her JD and MBA degrees at Indiana University, and then launched her career as an attorney in Chicago. She came back to her native West Michigan in 1996 to join the leadership team at Old Kent Financial, later acquired by Fifth Third Bancorp, rising to Fifth Third's West Michigan president. Mary was recruited then by Meyer, Inc. to be its chief compliance officer and senior VP for properties and real estate for about 4 years prior to her current posting. She has emerged as a cultural and community leader in West Michigan, and she's back home and with us here today after spending some precious time in the Florida sun recently for her wedding and honeymoon. Congratulations, Mary. But before we take a look at the challenges of planning a wedding in the midst of a pandemic and salvaging a symphony season in the age of COVID, let's begin with a little Dutch bingo. So Mary, tell us a little bit about your own Dutch heritage and the joy of double vowels, you no less, in your family name.
Well, Bruce, first of all, thank you for the introduction. And Bruce and I have actually enjoyed bantering a little bit about the commonality that we have with two U's in our last names and the propensity for mispronunciation by most who are not familiar with the Dutch language. So for me personally, I've gotten used to having a lot of misplaced addresses on the front of a mail envelope. And I'll commonly look for the name Mary Tuuk or Mary Tuuk, Truck or Tuck or Tauk, you name it. I'm ready to listen and read any mispronunciation of the name. And I think Bruce and I share that in common. But we have had some lovely conversations about our Dutch heritage. For me personally, probably the most impactful part of my own Dutch heritage is the story of my mother and her parents, my grandparents. So her parents are first generation immigrants. They came to West Michigan in the early 1900s, and in particular, my grandfather was one of 9 children. Both my grandmother and grandfather are from Friesland, and he and his brother, Elmer Lautenbach and Chester Lautenbach, came when they were teenagers to the United States on their own, never really saw a lot of their family for the rest of their lifetimes because the rest of the family stayed in the Netherlands. And it's an incredible story of how they settled on the southwest side of Grand Rapids in the Granville Avenue area in an environment of many other Dutch immigrants. But certainly the connections go far and wide, and we are very happy as an extended family with the many connections and areas of the Western Michigan community that we call home, and certainly that Dutch influence really permeates through, whether it's Grand Rapids, Holland, or Kalamazoo. My family and the extended family have connections through all of that in various stages of life.
The other day when we were talking, Mary, you mentioned that your grandfather and grandmother's story was kind of the classic American immigrant dream story. Can you explain to the audience what you meant by that?
Yeah. So my mother's parents, they were first generation Dutch immigrants. My grandfather came with his brother with very little. And they came because they had hopes for a better life in the United States. And for them, that very much was the case. My grandmother spent a lot of time with other Dutch immigrant friends as she raised her family. And in the case then of my mother, she became part of that American dream story of the next generation, kind of the classic baby boomer generation. My father also has Dutch heritage, although not as recent as my mother, but they both lived that life during that generation of experiencing the Depression. My father was a World War II veteran in the Army, and he came out of the war determined, as she was, to make a better life again. Neither one of them graduated from high school, but ultimately created that baby boomer family and experienced the American dream of success in business and a better life for them and their family. And they really promoted education for their children because they themselves did not graduate past high school. So it's really a wonderful story. It's one that, as the youngest of 4, I wish I had listened a lot more closely to the conversations at the dinner table, because when I was young and growing up, I was bored to death with conversations at the dinner table about World War II or the Depression, and now I think, oh, there was history unfolding right in front of me, and I wish I had paid more attention to it at the time, because it's such a wonderful, wonderful story of what success can look like here in the United States.
As I noted in my introduction of you, you chose music and business as a double major at Calvin, which seemed to be a perfect preparation for your current position, but it took you a little while to get to your current position. There was a lot of vocational territory you traveled between leaving Calvin in 1986 and then joining the symphony as its leader a couple of years ago. So take us on that serendipitous journey and how it prepared you for the work you're doing now.
Well, I like to tell folks who are interested in the path that in many respects, my entire professional career is what ultimately prepared me for this current role that I have with the Grand Rapids Symphony. And that may sound a little bit surprising, but leading a symphony organization is a very complex endeavor. And while the size of our organization is not large, we have about a $10 million budget, the leadership that's required is multifaceted and it's complex. It includes community networking, community collaboration, donor cultivation, labor negotiations and union negotiations with a union orchestra. It also includes navigation of a large board of directors and navigation of a foundation, as well as the day-to-day leadership of an administrative staff. So lots of complexities in that not-for-profit world. I think another misnomer that often finds itself in conversation is that leading a not-for-profit is not a business endeavor, it's a different kind of endeavor. And I would argue that it's every bit a business endeavor, the sole difference being that any surplus that's generated is ultimately used to fund the mission further of the not-for-profit as opposed to perhaps a surplus generated back to shareholders. So to answer your question, Bruce, my earlier years were very, very impactful and still play out today in my present day responsibilities. Great examples would be what I would refer to as kind of the toolkit that you develop in a professional career with varying experiences, their leadership experiences, sometimes their experiences about building a budget, financial results, successes, disappointments, the need to innovate, the need to pivot, the need to understand how technology plays a role in success and what technology can do to also hold an organization back. Understanding the operating environment, the economic environment, understanding the competitive environment. In our case today for the Grand Rapids Symphony, it's all about the competition for entertainment and now, of course, the limitations of a pandemic. Another example that oftentimes comes to play for me is crisis management. I was, for good or for worse, the chief risk officer of Fifth Third in 2008 and saw a little bit of crisis during that time with the implosion of the capital markets and the economy, the liquidity crisis, and learned a thing or two about crisis management during that time that has really played out well again in the course of this particular pandemic. So that journey for me outside of Calvin includes practicing law for a firm in Chicago for about 6 years, learning how to see issues from both sides of the argument, then continuing into the banking world, risk management, the financial crisis, and then again continuing at Meyer and learning something again about the needs of the West Michigan community, what customer experience, good customer experience looks like, and being able to translate all of those experiences into the present day experience. So in many respects, I feel extremely fortunate that I am where I am, but I am very glad that I took the path that I took to get here.
It is interesting to observe how our experiences in life often just build on themselves and then produce some unexpected and almost unimaginable fruit for the future. You know, I know music has been a really central part of your life, probably right from the start. Your older brother, Jonathan Tuuk, is a well-known organist and composer in Western Michigan. And I know that you are fluent in organ and piano and violin and vocals. You may not make the same claim that Jonathan might make, but the Greek philosopher Pythagoras said that music is the language of the heart, the only language that enters the soul without having to pass through the filter of the brain first. We won't delve too deeply into that, but what has been the role of music in your formation, Mary, and how did it become a language of your heart and soul?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and the first thing I think about when you ask that question is my early childhood. I grew up in a household of 4 children, the youngest of 4, and as you mentioned, my oldest brother Jonathan is a lifelong musician, as an organist, composer, tonal finisher, director of church music with several churches in the area, and recitalist. And so because of our age gap, we never really lived a lot together in the same household. But my earliest, most formative years were watching what he was doing as he was going through high school and his college years, and exploring the world of music really through the lens of his experiences. And so early on, I had exposure to not only a lot of organ music, but I had exposure to church music. I had exposure to choral music through some of the work that he was doing. And I knew fairly quickly that it was something that came quite easily to me. So about 3rd grade, my brother John said, well, I think it's time for you to start taking piano lessons. So he would actually come over to the house, and he would teach a lesson. But after about a year or 2, I can remember he had a conversation with our mother, and he said, you know what, I think we need a little bit more formal environment here. Me coming over and trying to do a piano lesson in the den in the middle of all of the other household activity is not the best. So early on, within about a year or 2 after that, I actually went down to his piano studio, which was his church, where he was employed at the time, and that's where I would take my piano lesson. So we started that route, and then I remember him suggesting in my high school years, well, what would you think about starting the organ? And I thought, oh, that would be a wonderful, wonderful experience, because I loved the sound of the organ in church. I loved especially the mixture sound, which is a much louder sound to the organ for those who aren't familiar with organ registrations. But it's the sound that you typically hear in hymns in church, etc. And I loved the sound of the softer colors, the strings, the reeds, the brass, and all of that became formative to me as I became interested in the keyboard. But also around middle school, I recognized that I was able to sing fairly easily, and it wasn't something I had to work very hard at. So pretty quickly by high school, I was getting more and more interested in singing. That translated into an interest in taking voice lessons, and that became part of my choral path through high school and ultimately through college and, frankly, adult life. And in today's environment, while I have still those keyboard skills to play the piano, the organ, I also play the violin. Probably what I do most easily and often right now is I sing. And I've had the ability to maintain that all the way throughout my professional career. And one thing that I really reflect back on now is no matter how intense things would get professionally for me during the workday, I loved the solace and the peace of being able to go to, say, a choir rehearsal in the evening, because it engages a different part of the brain. And that part of the brain that it engages forces out whatever had happened during the workday, through an office or a desk or a computer or a business meeting. It engages a different part of the brain, and it forced me to really connect back, as you said, Bruce, to the soul and that different part of the body that connects directly to music. Although I will say there is oftentimes a connection between those who find numbers and mathematics to be an easy endeavor and those who are musical. The musical scale is based on mathematics and numbers, and oftentimes you will see, whether it's technology or mathematicians or engineers, there's oftentimes a connection between those skill sets and those who enjoy creating music.
That's all really valuable biographical background, but we probably should move on to the heart of the matter, and that is this crazy year. What's it been like for you to lead an arts organization in 2020, the year that turned the stage lights out on Broadway theaters in New York City? How did you choose to approach the implications of this pandemic for your musicians and your audience members? Hibernation must have been contemplated, and it was a route taken by a number of orchestras around the country. But you chose a different path. In fact, you cleverly called it Path Waves. How and why did you take this path?
Yeah. Well, I would start by saying I remember those early weeks of March with absolute clarity. Those are weeks I will never forget, just like some of the big weeks during the financial crisis in September of 2008. Crisis has a way of searing certain things into your memory. And most recently, I remember that week of March. We ultimately made our announcements from the symphony standpoint on Thursday, March 12th. But I remember that week of March where literally every single day there were just these large-scale announcements that were unfolding that were unheard of. It was the college sector immediately closing campus, giving their students, in some cases, half a day to vacate the campus because of the pandemic. And then travel restrictions were announced, and it was one thing after another. And fairly quickly, we knew that we had some big decisions on our hands that were decisions that had never been made or had to be even considered in the history of the 90 years of the Grand Rapids Symphony. So we made some decisions very quickly on, I think it was March 12th, we announced we were going to cancel our concerts for the next 30 days and then reconsider where we would go from there. And by Friday, March 13th, I think all of the area schools had quickly converted to remote learning for at least the next month. But soon after that, after we made those initial announcements, we had another decision to make, which was where would we go? And we saw some orchestras in the field immediately shutting down all operations and furloughing musicians, furloughing administrative staff, because financially they could not continue to pay their musicians or their administrative staff. The cash flow would just not support it without the ticket revenue coming in. And in our case, we have a different financial framework that supports better cash flow, and we had some cash reserves as well as the strength of our donor community here in West Michigan. So we had some additional flexibility. And this decision then, for me personally, reminded me of the life of a musician. And I go back, witnessing not only the life of my oldest brother, but many other musicians that I've known for my entire life, and understanding that musicians commit to their craft not because of the financial reward, but because of the passion that they feel for music and their desire to use their gifts and their talents in that way. And the life of a musician is one that is typically not financially stable. And that voice in me kept saying, this is not the time to make a pure financial decision that will literally tear into the lives of the heart of the orchestra, our musicians and our artistic leaders, as well as our administrative staff. So it was a voice that said very quickly, find a way to keep doing what we do to deliver on our mission. How can we make this work? Even if we can't do live concerts, what can we do to immediately convert to a virtual platform and put in place a new financial plan that will support our desire to continue the mission? And that's what we did. I will tell you, we never gave any serious thought at all to shutting down operations or furloughing. It just wasn't even a consideration. And We're fortunate that the West Michigan community is supportive of us, that our board and foundation are equally supportive of us, and they also never had a serious thought in that regard. So then it just became an exercise in how do we immediately convert and innovate into a virtual platform. And one of the very first productions that came out of that a couple of weeks later was a virtual production of the Hallelujah Chorus with the orchestra and about 20 of our symphony chorus singers. It was something we had never attempted before. Now it's a lot more commonplace because of the use of all of these new technology applications. But at the time, we had to figure out how to do it on our own, and we were one of the first in the industry to do that. But we did what I would call the Hollywood Squares version of the Hallelujah Chorus, with boxes appearing of instrumentalists as well as singers. And we decided to release that production on Easter weekend, the Thursday before Easter, because we thought that the message of the Hallelujah Chorus and hope was one that was sorely needed by our community in the pandemic. And it ultimately leads to the question of how did we get from there to our fall programming here, the Pathwaves series. And that name, Pathwaves, was coined by us as we were thinking about our path forward as an orchestra in the midst of a pandemic. It was also coined as we think about our connection to the West Michigan community. So Pathwaves connotes our path forward, a path of hope and a path of healing for a community that's been ravaged not only by a pandemic and the loss of the arts, live entertainment, but also a community that's been deeply impacted by protests of racial injustice, in some cases violent protests, and we've seen it across the country. And as we thought about those waves, we said they're not only waves of hope, but they connect directly to the West Michigan community because they're also waves of sound. That's what we deliver on with our mission, as well as we live in an area that has waves amongst it, represented in Lake Michigan as well as many inland lakes. So for us, it just became a natural term to use about our path forward.
And it's soothing as well. Mm-hmm. So I want to invite our audience to submit a question at any time in the chat box. I noticed that my friend Mike Van Denen has a sage question. He wonders, Mary, if you think the pandemic has underscored the importance of the arts in our community, or are people perhaps forgetting the contributions of the arts to civic life?
Yeah, I think that the pandemic has actually underscored the importance of the arts. One of the things that we found, for example, last summer, is that the community was starved for any form of live arts entertainment. And our typical summer would be a summer at Canonsburg, bringing thousands of people together for our Picnic Pops concerts under the July evening with the stars and the nice warm temperatures and a big shell in front. Obviously, we couldn't do that, but what we could do over the summer is leverage the outdoors and bring the orchestra to the community directly in the form of some small ensembles. We also debuted a program called Sidewalk Serenades, where donors or patrons could ask for a small ensemble of the orchestra to play and perform directly in their home, or I should say outside their home in the front yard or the sidewalk or their backyard. And what we found is that the community demand for those types of experiences far surpassed what we ever thought would be the case. And so we found a community that was starving for live arts entertainment. What we've seen this fall is that the demand for our virtual offerings, the Pathways program, has been very strong. But like everything else, while we converted to virtual platforms of delivery, so has every other sector. And what we hear often from our audience is that they love the virtual platform, but they can't wait to return back to live experience. The virtual platform will never quite match what that live experience is. So I think if anything, it's underscoring the appreciation and the demand that our audiences have for live entertainment. So our hope is that the pandemic path itself will become more clear as the vaccines are rolled out and the confidence is restored again.
Nice. I wonder if you could maybe do a little riff on your dreams and hopes for the future. I read your end of year fundraising appeal, and
Mm-hmm.
it was really surprisingly optimistic, and quite often in at a time like this, you can count on people being a little panicked, and
Mm-hmm.
this was really the antithesis of panic. It really felt like you're in a good spot, and
Mm-hmm.
you hope to grow for the future. But obviously, planning super unpredictable this year, and for the
Mm-hmm.
most part, even frankly, impossible. But so
Mm-hmm.
how do you hope to be delivering on your mission in the months and years ahead?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things that has helped us is the experience, at least for me personally, that I had navigating through the financial crisis back in 2008. I can remember there were certain days where we were wondering back at the bank, whether it was our bank or other large banks, where would the FDIC come next, and were banks going to be closing down, or would there be these sudden mergers because of liquidity crises? And there's something about that experience that, at least for me personally, gave me a sense of calm that said, you know what, for as awful as that time was, and for as scary as that time was, not only did my institution that I was a part of at that time come through it with flying colors, but our economy came through it with flying colors. And so for me personally, it gave me a sense of calm to realize that, you know what, yet once again, we're not going to get derailed by what's happening either with the job market or with the capital markets, because time will have a natural way of restoring whatever this immediate shock and disruption is. It may not come back as quickly as we would like, but it will come back. It's cyclical. And so that for me personally gave me a sense of long-term solution, which then was something I tried to impart with all of our constituencies, whether it was our musicians, our artistic leaders, our board, our administrative staff, our donors. And we also knew that financially, we had a path of stability to get through this fiscal year, which we're calling our pandemic year, and that will end on August 31st of 2021. So then, Bruce, to your point, the real question is what's next, and what's the long-term path of the symphony? And we are fortunate here that in West Michigan, we have a very appreciative community, not only for our form of performing arts, but other performing arts, whether it's the ballet, whether it's the opera, civic theater. And so we are thinking about what is the continuing leadership role that we can play in the West Michigan community to provide that forum of live arts experience to the community. How can we continue to partner with our other organizations like the ballet, the opera, the museums, Meyer Gardens, the Graham? We've done work with all of them over the last couple of years. But then to answer your question a little bit more specifically, I think a big part of this is being able to envision what the mission looks like post-pandemic. It's going to be a combination of live arts experiences, as we've seen pre-pandemic, but I think you'll also see the symphony coming out more directly into the community than you saw before the pandemic. And one of the things that we heard from our summer is that patrons and audiences loved seeing our musicians up close. And the more we can replicate those types of experiences where the musicians become, in the eyes of the audience, real residents of the community, the better. And the more we can make that experience one that's comfortable and inclusive for all, the better, whether again it's in the hall or in the community. So those are all things that we're thinking about. I would also tell you that across the state, We continue to have a very strong partnership with Blue Lake, which is the classical radio station in West Michigan. That will continue. We have a good relationship with Interlochen, and we will continue to explore ways that we can build on that partnership. And then also think about ways that we can continue to be a leader in the orchestra field for innovation. And one of the things that we've also heard in the orchestra industry is that our Pathwave series and the quality of the audio and the video production, as well as what we're doing, is being noticed in the industry. And so I don't like to do too much to toot our own horn here, but it is being noticed in the industry. We are an orchestra that has continued to pay its musicians and to pay its administrative staff. We have not furloughed, and we're finding ways to make music available to the community even in the pandemic. And all of that is something that is being noticed in the industry, which ultimately is a good thing for the West Michigan community, because it will allow us to continue to attract high quality musicians to the orchestra in the future as well. And positive momentum builds on positive momentum in the same way that downward spirals can occur. One positive leads to the next positive, and we know that that will lead to a bright future for us.
Nice. I'm going to invite my friend and neighbor in both Grand Haven, Michigan, and Green Valley, Arizona, David Hookema, to unmute himself and start up his video. He has popped a question into the chat, but I think he'd probably be even more articulate, if not cogent, in speaking to it directly. David?
Well, okay, I'm unmuted. You caught me out. I was out cleaning up some stuff in the garage while listening. Taking advantage of my invisibility. You know, it's like everyone has on Zoom. Everybody has a Harry Potter invisibility cloak. My comment. I've been watching a number of the Pathways programs. I was really impressed by the technology of streaming simultaneously from the Meyer Dance Center and DeVos Hall. There were some glitches there. It seemed to me, and one of the reasons I asked about musicians is it struck me that musicians were struggling mightily to maintain the kind of string ensemble that this orchestra normally has, and it worked most of the time. Mm-hmm. But that was a brave experiment, and that's worked really well. But I wonder, it must really be hard for musicians to play in those strange circumstances where they're masked and sitting far apart, to play for an empty hall. And, musicians, of course, are really motivated, as you said. It's a life that they love. They aren't in it for the money. But without people, that they are used to playing with in large ensembles, and without people out in the hall, there's a kind of, anybody who's performed knows there's a kind of magic when you sense that the audience is right there with you. And you can't sense that when you're live streaming. It's gone. So I wonder what you could say about the morale, especially among musicians, but also among staff in this difficult time. We don't know how long it's going to last.
Yeah. Well, I'll start first by answering that question from a musician standpoint. The morale of the musicians, I think, all in all, is very good. And that's driven by the fact that we are still performing. We are still making live music, albeit a very different form of live music right now. But we are still performing, we are still making music, and the musicians are being paid. So that is certainly a big contributor to the morale. As David pointed out, the challenges of performing are very different than what they were in a normal environment. Musicians are trained to perform as an ensemble and as a tight ensemble, which is based on sitting much closer to each other and being able to clearly hear, to be able to deliver that tight ensemble that audiences are used to expecting. So with our COVID-19 work rules, we have to space our musicians 6 feet apart. They are all wearing masks unless they are wind and brass players, and if they're wind and brass players, they're tested before a performance week. So the environment in which they perform is, by definition, very, very different. Same thing in the summer where everything was done outdoors, and sometimes the weather conditions weren't exactly favorable. It was getting pretty cold there, especially in early September. I would say the same thing for some of our vocal programs. We've tried to do some things on a very limited basis with very small ensembles of singers singing through singer masks. And as a singer myself, I can tell you that the experience I had singing distanced outdoors through a singer mask 8 feet apart from another singer was really hard. So that is certainly not desirable, but what permeates through all of it is the fact that music is still being made. And I would tell you that the musicians are happy that we are delivering on our mission. They are also very, very happy that we have found a way to do it that works financially for us. Now, with all of that said, I would be the first one to lead the bandwagon that we can't wait to perform naturally again. And I count myself in that pack as a singer. I sing in the symphony chorus, and we want to be able to do those traditional performances again. So we are looking forward to when that day returns. And then the morale of our administrative staff, I will tell you that they have done yeoman's work during the year 2020 because they have constantly had to plan, cancel, modify, adjust, replan, modify, cancel, and at the same time they've had to innovate regularly with a new platform, a Vimeo platform for our patrons, and new audio and video production platform for these live stream performances. So it takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of perseverance, and it's a lot of hard work. And so I can't say enough about the wonderful work that they have done this year to be able to constantly adapt to that. I've gotten the question many times of what's it like to plan during a pandemic, and my answer is planning during a pandemic has severe limitations. It's a fool's errand if you try to plan too much right now. And so they really shoulder that burden more than anybody else, and they've done just a wonderful job.
Let me just add that I read this earlier too, but the fact that the symphony has kept its staff and musicians on the payroll is really remarkable, and that's a great motivator for donors, because obviously ticket revenue is not coming in. But that's just a wonderful gesture of faith in the organization and the community. I really, really admire that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Another question from the chat board. What advice might you have, Mary, for other arts organizations trying to navigate these turbulent times?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing is to try not to shoulder that direct burden of the pandemic every minute of the day. It's very easy to get overwhelmed with all of the unknowns, with all of the uncertainties, with the bad news. And one thing that for me personally was really important is I made a commitment as the leader of the arts organization not to read every single news headline every single day. And no disrespect to the media intended here, but it would be very easy to get into a dark place reading every single headline that was either an Apple News story or turning the TV on and whatever station it is, whether it's the networks or the cable channels or otherwise. Those headlines are difficult when you read about, record levels of COVID-19 cases or record positivity rates or, the latest on the vaccine rollout, etc. So I think it's important to keep abreast of what's going on, but not to make that your life. And that's something that we talked about as a team at the Symphony, that we would all as individual leaders commit to that, and that we would try to focus not on mourning what we couldn't do, but to focus instead on what we could do. So we made an intentional commitment as a team, probably back around April or May, that we were not going to mourn what we had lost. It doesn't mean that we don't know what we lost, but we would not mourn what we lost, but we would instead think about what we could do. And that kind of a mindset shift really makes a big, big difference. The other thing that for us became very important, and this was probably more early fall, we made a commitment that we would show each other grace and patience as we were all rapidly learning new things, because our jobs changed dramatically. We didn't have an internal Vimeo expert at the time, as an example. We had never done a direct audio, video, live stream production ever in the 90-year history of the symphony. And we were trying to figure out how to do it, in some cases, in a matter of weeks. And so we made a commitment to each other as a team and as a broader symphony family that we would show each other grace and patience and understanding as we learned, because inevitably we were going to make mistakes. Inevitably there would be things that wouldn't go as well as what we had imagined. But understanding the backdrop of that journey and being able to work with each other in that context, we knew was an important positive contributor to the culture of the symphony. And those are some of the pieces of advice that I would impart to other arts organizations going through the same thing.
Another great question from the chat. What are some of your favorite classical pieces that have comforted and inspired you during this pandemic?
Mm-hmm.
You find yourself turning to some particular pieces time and again?
Oh, yes. My longtime favorite piece is the Mahler Resurrection Symphony. And one of the reasons why I love it so much is because of the multiple musical forces that are required to perform it. It requires a very, very large orchestra, and it also requires a large chorus. Oftentimes choruses of 100 or more will be standing on the stage, and it also involves the organ. And for me personally, it's a really wonderful musical composition because it uses all of the instruments that I love. So my favorite part of the Mahler Resurrection Symphony is at the very end. It's a fairly long piece. It's probably close to 90 minutes. But after about 60, 70 minutes of the orchestra performing the symphony, the chorus finally comes in with two soloists. And then it builds at the end into something really big and wonderful that includes the full chorus. And then finally the full organ comes in. The German is Auferstehen. It's this big moment at the end of a long symphony. But the theme of it is about hope. It's about resurrection. And regardless of one's own religious beliefs, whether they're there or not, what Mahler had in mind is it was a theme of hope and new beginnings and literally a resurrection. And so it's especially something that for me personally still gives me chills. I can't tell you how many times I've either been part of a live performance of it or I've listened to it, and every time it gives me chills. And for me, it's very inspirational during this time.
Nice. Well, you're getting some praise on the chat room from Dennis Butine. Thank you, Mary, for your steady leadership for the Grand Rapids Symphony Orchestra, and especially for keeping the musicians fully employed. David Hookema says, "I'm glad you didn't cite Strauss's Death and Transfiguration."
Right.
And Mike Van Denen asks, how can patrons of art organizations bolster their communities, symphonies, museums, etc., during these challenging days? What can the Kleine Leiden do?
Yeah. I think in addition to the obvious, which is always going to be financial support for the operating budget, so I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention that for the symphony as well. We would always appreciate any support for the operating budget right now, and you can look us up on our website at grsymphony.org for that, and we would be very appreciative of that. But in addition to financial support, I think the advocacy in the Western Michigan community is especially critical right now. I've talked a couple of times now about the fact that we have a community that is very supportive of the arts, unlike what we've seen in a lot of other cities where these decisions to furlough the orchestra were made pretty quickly and made in big places like the New York Philharmonic, Boston Symphony. We've seen it in Indianapolis. We've seen it in other cities of our size. So serving as an advocate for why the arts are important, and not just for our own personal nurturing of the soul, but they're also important to our community for economic reasons. And so whatever one's particular background or discipline or persuasion is, I would encourage that individual to use that lens to continue to advocate for the importance of the arts in Western Michigan. We are very blessed with the arts culture that we have here in West Michigan, and we can't take it for granted.
We're getting close to the end of our hour together. I do have one question. You know, the Dutch Americans, at least in Western Michigan, are known for many things, sometimes contradictory things. Duty, diligence, thriftiness, piety all come immediately to mind. There are other adjectives which I'm not going to venture into at this point, but I'd be interested to know what you think your own Dutch American experience has meant in your own development as a leader in the West Michigan community.
Yeah. You know, I really love this question, Bruce, because it immediately makes me think about my parents and what I learned from them. And one thing that they taught me, and really not intentionally, it's just the example that they set, they taught me about the world of possibilities. It never occurred to them that failure would ever be an option or that one should be daunted by a challenge. So they taught me that lesson of always thinking about what the possibility is rather than immediately focusing on what the obstacle or the challenge might be. The other thing that they taught me was this sense of perseverance and not losing hope in what was attainable, even if it takes a long time and it requires a whole lot of hard work. Stay the course. That's another phrase that really pops to mind. And I saw that play out in the example that they both set, either in business or with some of the other decisions that they made in their personal life along the way and how they raised us and encouraged us. So to answer your question a little bit more succinctly, what really pops to mind is imagine the possibility and stay the course.
Beautiful. Mary, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to enlighten us on a little bit of your background and your passion for leading and for keeping the music alive. Mm-hmm. I'll throw it back to my good friend, Mike Van Denen.
Thank you, Bruce.
Mary, thank you so much. Thank you, and for just great wisdom. We've been hearing now some more through the chat box, more appreciation for you, and there's a message that the folks wish the GR Symphony strength and support to endure, where they're grateful for your steady leadership. That's great, and I do think we've got that foundation of support for the arts, and particularly for the symphony, has been such a treasure in our community for so many years. Thank you for those great words and helpful words. Bruce, thank you for leading and guiding the conversation. You two should have a talk show, regular talk show together. I think that would be great. The two U's, maybe, or something.
It's all about you.
That's right.
Yeah, we'll think about that. Maybe that could be a regular feature of the NAF West Michigan's contributions to the community. So thank you both very much. Thank you to those who are listening. We're going to have this conversation saved and available for further viewing. So keep an eye out for that. We'll send all of you that information soon, and look for more contributions from the NAF West Michigan soon. Have a great day, have a great week, and have a blessed holiday season.